Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Episcopal Church's class over the history of Christian worship. Today, we are going to be talking about post-Reformation practices of the Holy Communion. This is going to cover a lot of ground in a not comprehensive fashion, but a broad enough fashion that we will begin to see the contours of some of our more contemporary practice that we see to modern day. As we talk about post-Reformation, we have to start talking about denominations and denominationalism. We have to start talking about specific expressions of the church that are specifically Protestant in nature, but are different from each other in the ways that they express how they are church and the theology of the church that they find themselves in. We talked last time about the magisterial reformers, and particularly the magisterium referring to referring to state, referring to a reformation that has to do with both a church-state relationship. In the middle of all of that, there is another movement going on that is going to primarily bring about what we see in modern day U.S. context, which is Congregationalism. Now, Congregationalism isn't really a thing until we get to probably the later 1600s and 1700s, but the forerunners of Congregationalism are present within the European continent, and at least as we properly refer to them within the Church of England, and they're called the Puritans. Who are the Puritans at this time? Well, to know what the Puritans are, we have to think, at least more specifically, at least in the English sense, we have to think about what exactly is going on in England in post-Reformation. Now, Puritanism is more of a ubiquitous term in modern day. Specifically, what we're going to be talking about is the Puritan sensibilities that give rise to Congregationalism in the U.S. So, where do the Puritans come from? The Puritans come from a branch, or at least a section of the Church of England that does not believe that the English Reform went far enough. This is something that you can find within the continent as well. They're known as different names on the continental reforms. But in a large sense, they are people who don't believe that the Reformation in the Church of England through the Book of Common Prayer was enough. In other words, we're still too popish in a certain fashion. There is too much structure. There's too many things in the worship of the Book of Common Prayer that are not explicitly found in Scripture. Here is where the major issues of Puritanism come in. Puritans are the people within the Church of England that, number one, don't believe that the Book of Common Prayer went far enough in its reform. Why did they think this? Well, they are decidedly more Calvinistic in sensibility, so they are capital R Reformed in theology. In other words, what they are seeing is that we haven't gotten rid of ceremonies or things that are not found explicitly within Scripture. So what do they mean by this? Well, how is a church service of Holy Communion supposed to function? Well, in the Puritan sensibility, there's still a lot of formal ceremony contained within the Book of Common Prayer. There's still a lot of practice within the Book of Common Prayer that are not matching up with what the Puritans believe is a true biblical sensibility. In other words, what Puritans, for the most part, will say is that if it's not in Scripture, it should not be done. What should be done is only what we see in Scripture. And this is where Puritans will, at this time period, mostly lean on in the Holy Communion that this is the Lord's Supper. This is a do in remembrance of me. There is no explicit theology in their argument that there is anything special going on in this meal other than it is a memorial meal. Now, of course, in Calvin and Bucer's theology, so John Calvin and Martin Bucer, who share a lot of a similar theology, there's nothing in the bread and wine themselves that is any different than any other bread and wine. It is simply the holy use of these things. It is the functional aspect of using the bread and wine in the context of the service that makes them mean something more. And it is in the proper receiving of these things that elevates one's heart to where Christ is. This is going to be a relatively common Puritan sensibility. But Puritans also are going to have a specific strain of Zwinglianism with them as well, as we talked about, where if it's not at the very most the right use, it is at the very least just a memorial meal. There's nothing special going on in these things. But specifically what the complaints that arise from the Puritans as it comes to the most current Book of Common Prayer of the time that the Puritans become a pretty big voice in England is during what is called the 1559 Book of Common Prayer. The 1559 is the third edition of the Book of Common Prayer under Elizabeth I, who is a middle-of-the-road type of monarch. She is more concerned with the stability of England after a rapid succession of kings and queens all in a row, and also a rapid flip-flopping between the Roman Catholic sensibilities and the Protestant sensibilities of the kings and queens of the time. Henry VIII, staunch Catholic, go over to Edward VI, pretty reformed, at least involving his advisors, pretty middle-of-the-road Protestant. But then you have Mary, also called Bloody Mary, Mary who overtakes the throne and tries to re-establish Roman Catholicism, and then you have Elizabeth I. So Elizabeth is trying to shoot a political middle ground between these various factions that have a rapid succession all in a row, and she's trying to stabilize the kingdom. Well, one of the ways she tries to stabilize the kingdom is by providing a light revision to the Book of Common Prayer in 1559. However, the Puritans have some very major complaints about what's going on in these light revisions. Specifically, they seek extensive change to the worship. In other words, again, we didn't go far enough. They see within the particular rubrics, the guidelines for how you do these particular services, they see within these rubrics too much of an enshrinement of unnecessary ceremony and wrong theology. By and large, the Church of England is going to retain its more Armenian leanings instead of its Calvin leanings. Calvin and Jacobus Arminius, both Presbyterians, or at least forerunners of Presbyterians, have different ideas as to how God's grace works, and as to how predestination functions. And what the Puritans, who are capital R Reformed Calvinists, see is that Armenian theology is being enshrined in the Book of Common Prayer, and they see this as a drastic error from what they believe is what more specifically what the right teaching is. But the other thing that is a big problem for the Puritans is ceremonial focus. Puritans are going to be alert. Ceremony to Puritans is radioactive. Ceremony evokes Roman Catholicism. Any type of ceremony that you have that elevates anything about the Holy Communion for the Puritans is going to be equated with holding on to things about Roman Catholicism, which they believe is of the devil, very literally. And so the Puritans are going to have an allergic reaction to anything that is ceremonial. But of course, the Book of Common Prayer, by its very nature, does contain the ceremonies and rites of the Church of England. So Puritans become a force within this time. And it is helpful to remember that the settlers that settle in the quote-unquote New World, or in the continent that we now call North America, those are Puritans that are settling in the area. They are people who are going to be of this kind of theology, which means that when the colonies start to get colonized in the original 13 within the context of the North American continent, we have to remember that these were descendants of the Puritans that are going to give rise to Congregationalism. So, as it comes to how we get to modern day, here are the seeds that get planted. Modern Congregationalists are going to be Reformed at most, and are going to be Zwinglian at the very widest margin. They are going to have a theology of the Holy Eucharist that does not have any immediate presence within the bread and wine themselves. And they are going to be non-ceremonial. They're going to emphasize the biblicism of, if it's not in the Bible, you don't do it. If it is in the Bible, you do it. And the ceremonies of the Church of England, and especially the Roman Catholic Church, and especially the Lutheran Reforms, the ceremonialist types of leanings of the Church of England are not going to be something that the Puritans like. And so when we think about the U.S. context, we are so affected by the original people who came over and who began to settle and colonize the land, that we have to remember where our European forerunners came from in that context. Now, of course, there are going to be Roman Catholics that are coming over as well, rather whether it be in conquest or whether it be as refugees. The difference between Irish Catholics and Spanish Catholics during the various conquests that happen, but also the refugees that come from conflicts within Ireland. The thing that we have to remember is that they bring their theology with them. Their theology doesn't stay at home. It comes, it grows, and depending on how pervasive that theology becomes, it deeply affects the way that our society functions. So you can thank the Puritans for being the particular group of people that don't believe the Church of England went far enough in their revisions because of the ceremonialist aspects of the Book of Common Prayer and because of Armenian-type theology that the Church of England more readily holds to. Now, the other thing that happens that is sort of the last-ditch effort for Puritans is that the monarchy is a problem for Puritans. The monarchy in the Church of England is a big issue. And what happens during the time period of all of these theological battles is also there are civil battles that are being fought. And specifically the Civil War within England is a big marker as to how theologically the church is going to move forward. So the Civil War and the Interregnum in the 1600s results in several different things happening. You have the Scottish developing the 1637 Book of Common Prayer during the Interregnum. And what's happening here is that Scots are taking the liberty to be able to hearken back to an earlier form of the Book of Common Prayer in 1549 as the basis of their Book of Common Prayer. Now, remember, the 1549 was the most conservative English reform of the Latin Mass. And for that to be a foundational block for the Scots became a real big deal breaker for the Puritans, because what they're seeing is a reversion, a stepping back into what the Puritans would see as Roman enormities. And that is absolutely radioactive to Puritans, is the enshrinement of that kind of ceremony. But the other thing that happens is that if you remember, in the 1549, because it's a light revision of the Latin Mass, there is language of real change in the elements of the bread and the wine in the Eucharist. It is body and blood. That is also no deal for the Puritans. And it's because they are ordinance theology at the very least, and receptionist theology, which is a way of describing a more Calvin Bootser type of receptionist type of theology, rather than there being an actual real presence. When that happens, you have what happens within the wider context of Puritanism, a political effort to revise the Book of Common Prayer even more at this time. And so what happens is that you have some liturgical scholarship being done by Anglicans as to what is the proper way of worship. This results in the most widely used Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican tradition to modern day, and it is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. What happens in the 1662, though, is that the 1662 is what officially causes the Puritans to break away as a separate group. This is where we refer to people of the Puritans as being nonconformists, because they refused to conform to the doctrine and discipline and worship of the Church of England. They were labeled as nonconformists. In other words, they were not worshiping in accordance to what the official worship book of the Church of England was. There were, of course, legal allowances for nonconformists to gather, but there was still a very strict code as to what the official practice of Christianity was for the Church of England. And these nonconformists are the ones that are going to be foundational for Congregationalism. But what the 1662 also does is it also has another effect in the opposite direction from Puritanism. You have something that happens in around the 1662, which is called the Savoy Conference. For us in the Episcopal Church, this is an important thing for our history in the Church of England. But the Savoy Conference attempts to chart a middle course between Puritanism and a more, what we would call Laudianism focus. There is a specific person named William Laud that focuses on the strict adherence to the rubrics of the Book of Common Prayer, in which the Book of Common Prayer is going to be more of a middle road between strict Puritanism and a ceremonialist kind of approach. This is where sometimes the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church refers to itself as both Protestant and Catholic. This is because of the ceremonial aspect. Not necessarily the theological aspect, but the ceremonial aspect for the Puritans was such a big deal that anything ceremonial was Roman Catholic for Puritans. But for the Church of England, anything Puritan was nonconformist. So where's the middle ground here? Well, all of this is in the lead up to the restoration of the monarchy in the Church of England, which is the last nail in the coffin for the Puritans as it comes to where they are in England. So when you have the restoration of the monarchy, you have during the time of this restoration a movement, a departure, an immigration to the North American continent, and in this immigration to the North American continent, you have all kinds of exchange of European sensibilities and the inheritance of the European Protestant Reformation that is starting to influence the way that the colonies in the North American continent are running their churches. Puritans primarily are going to have come out of them Congregationalist churches, such as the Baptist Church, such as the Wesleyan Church that we're going to talk about here in just a minute. But you're going to have nonconformist churches that are going to start forming Congregationalist churches within that area. However, there's also a sharing of Church of England that comes over to the colonies of the North American continent, as well as Roman Catholicism. And all of these things are kind of in a melting pot together as it comes to the colonies. And depending on which colony you're in, will really determine kind of where you come from, at least as it comes to your practice. Like, for example, if you are from Virginia, Virginia hugely influenced by Congregationalist Protestantism. If you're from New York, New York was one of the only places where it wasn't illegal to be Roman Catholic within the colonies. And so the thing is that in New York, you're gonna have a much more Catholic centered areas within New York, whereas in Virginia, you're not going to find that anywhere. And likewise, the Church of England, the churches in the Episcopal Church in New York and the churches in Virginia could not be different as it comes to architecture and as it comes to the history of the theological inheritance of those places. But let's talk about the Wesleys, because the thing is that John and Charles Wesley, just to put it out there, John and Charles Wesley were Anglican priests. And when they came over to the New World, one of the things that in the Anglican tradition, in the Episcopal tradition, is that we are formed around bishops. Well, the thing is that bishops are the people who ordain pastors. And we don't have bishops over in the colonies. And so what happens is that John and Charles Wesley, or at least specifically one of the Wesley brothers, begins sending out and ordaining pastors outside of what the Church of England would officially understand as the succession of bishops. This leads to a separation between the Wesleys and the Church of England. But there is a particular focus in this time called Methodism. Now, Methodism was not originally meant to be a denomination in and of itself. It was simply a way that one approaches the way that you should do church. And of course, the idea of Methodism implies method. There is something to be done in your reception of the communion. In the 18th century, when we get to Methodism, we have to recognize that this is born out of an English prayer book sensibility. And so in the 1784 communion office, what we have is a focus on the prayer book spirituality, the reception of Holy Communion, and even more than just a weekly reception, a more than regular reception of Holy Communion. In other words, not just a weekly reception, but a more than once weekly reception of Holy Communion. And the 1784 communion office is a 1662 Book of Common Prayer rite that has a little bit of modification done to it. In that very sense, everything about that looks like the 1662, except for some things such as an extemporaneous prayer being added at the end, such as the certain prayers being put into a different kind of order. And the thing is that this is not really a major departure from what run-of-the-mill Church of England practitioners would see. And so we have within the Methodist Church both a Congregationalist kind of influence, at least as it comes to the top-down structure of bishops, priests, and deacons. They're more of a pastorate along with bishops. It's one of those deals where someone who is more attuned with Methodism can comment on this more specifically. But all it is to say is that it's a specific kind of method that one approaches the service of Holy Communion. But the other thing about the Church of England is that during the 18th century, there is also the opposite end of the pendulum swing that happens. So you have Puritanism on the one hand that is very Congregationalist, very Protestant in nature. You also have another movement that happens within the 1800s after the Methodist movement gets running, which is something called the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement is primarily associated with the U.S. context in the Church of England. There's actually a historian, Peter Nockels, who locates the Oxford movement rather as an Oxford American movement. That the Oxford movement that we associate with Oxford over in England also had perhaps a tandem movement with the U.S. context, in the way that the more Catholic side of the English church began to express itself in a return to some very key tenets of what they believe is proper tradition within the church. Well, guess what? Proper tradition within the church is going to look decidedly Western and decidedly Roman Catholic. Here is where you get the approach to the ceremonial aspects of the Holy Communion in what we would call ritualism. Ritualism is born out of a focus in the Church of England and in the American Episcopal Church on the revamping and re-engaging of holy tradition within the church. In other words, instead of the Puritan sensibility of we didn't go far enough with the change in the liturgical structure, the ritualist movement is a decidedly conservative and traditionalist movement as it comes to worship and liturgy, and as it comes to theology of church-state relationships. And not to get too into the weeds on this, but the way that the Holy Communion gets modified within this particular time period is that, on the one hand, you have the ritualists bringing back aspects of the traditional liturgy of the Latin Mass that for a lot of Protestants was simply a reversion to what the Roman Catholics are doing. A very common criticism of what we would call Anglo-Catholics of this time period, or English Catholics. Catholics within the Church of England, or Anglicans who would describe themselves as Catholic in heritage. One of the very common things that is described of Anglo-Catholics is that they are just doing what the Romans do. This is true in some sense, because the ritualists bring back almost whole hog the Latin Mass in the English context. During the ritualist movement, you actually have the movement back to some services being completely in Latin, and some services being a complete use of the Latin Latin missals MISSALS of the Roman Catholic Church, and again adopting almost entirely the Roman Catholic ceremonial. This is not necessarily what all Anglo-Catholics do, though. There are many Anglo-Catholics who are very faithful prayer book practitioners who emphasize the theology of the traditional church, of the holy tradition which is held over from the medieval time period. And so what you are going to find is, as opposed to Zwingli and Calvin, you're going to find a lot of theologians who hearken back to the patristic time period about real presence within the Holy Communion. You will find some theologians within this movement of the Oxford movement defending the idea of transubstantiation as being a perfectly acceptable way of understanding the proper way to see the Holy Communion as functioning. And so theologians like this are going to rise up during the Oxford movement and the ritualism movement of the 19th century. So we go all the way from Puritanism, which is part and parcel of modern U.S. Protestantism. Evangelical Protestantism within the U.S. is dominantly of the Congregationalist nonconformist side, but you also have a swinging towards the other side of the spectrum as well in a more specifically recoverative, a ritual recovery of what was lost within the reforms of the Protestant Reformation. And this is where we have to start talking about the melting pot that is our U.S. context. The U.S. context is a very interesting one because it has all of these elements swirling around in different degrees. Depending on where you go in the U.S., you will encounter different expressions of the Holy Communion that are direct descendants of what happens within the Protestant Reformation as it comes through the 1500s and 1600s, especially as it comes to Puritan sensibilities or the Puritan type of sensibilities within the continent of Europe, and as it comes to the Roman Catholic sensibilities that nonetheless continue in their reforms as well, and the more middle-of-the-road sensibilities that are in the Protestant Church of England that kind of waffle back and forth as to what kind of church or what kind of Protestant sensibility it wants to have. And so when it comes to the lead up to the 20th and the 21st century, which we'll talk about next time, we need to understand that we have a multiplicity of practice when it comes to the Holy Communion within these churches. However, there are main strains of theology that remain relatively the same. Presbyterians are largely going to be receptionist in theology, which is going to harken back to Martin Bucer and John Calvin. Congregationalists are going to be very influenced by both receptionism and ordinance theology of Huldrych Zwingli. So both of these would say that there is no change within the elements of bread and wine in the context of the Holy Communion. They are bread and wine that serve a larger symbolic purpose, and nonetheless have an effective way of effecting the way that we interiorly are to partake of them. Our action needs to be faithful. We have to examine ourselves, as St. Paul would say. So there's still a very high importance put on this reception of the Holy Communion, but not in the same way that the Church of England, that Lutherans and the Roman Catholics will continue in their theology as they continue forward into the wider context of both Europe and into the North American context. What you will find within those churches is a real presence theology. There is really the presence of Christ within the elements of the Holy Eucharist. You are really partaking of the body and blood. How exactly that happens will get different answers depending on who you ask. The Roman Catholic Church, the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, officially all the way up until the 20th century, was transubstantiation or nothing else. This was the way you understood it in official Catholic teaching. As it comes to the Lutherans and as it comes to the Church of England, a little bit of different leeway as it is, but some within the Church of England would be whole hog transubstantiationists, as we would see within the 19th century ritualist movement of the Oxford movement. But you also would have the theology of a real presence, although transubstantiation is not the most true way we can understand this, rather it being a spiritual presence. There is something that is spiritually present that is not the same thing as a Aristotelian Thomas Aquinas way of understanding transubstantiation. In other words, you don't have to be an Aristotelian in philosophy in order to believe that Jesus is actually present. Where does that leave us? Why is this important? It's important because we need to understand that the roots of the Reformation and the theologies of the presence of Christ within the Holy Communion that began in the Western Church in the 800s is still being meted out through these reforms and will be described in great detail next time when we get to our contemporary context. Radtramnus and Radbertus, both of these monks that had the argument over is the figure the body and blood and the truth the bread and wine, or is the figure the bread and wine and the truth the body and blood? So go back a couple of videos to find that argument. That argument is still the primary argument that is being had today. And it is the primary misunderstanding between denominations because we don't know our history as much as we might need to. But that is the point of having a class like this, so that we can catch up with our history of Christian worship, specifically, at the moment, over the history of the Holy Communion. Until next time, friends, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion of the post-Reform and the post-Reformation focus on the Holy Communion and the differences in how the Puritans gave rise to Congregationalists and Nonconformists, and how the focus of the Church of England gave rise to another movement of the Anglo-Catholic movement, of the Oxford movement, and the Ritualist movement of the 1800s. And also the wider movements in theology as it comes to the North American context. Next time, we will be dealing specifically with the 20th century and 21st century, and then we will end with our focus on the ecumenical movement and how denominations across the world are trying to understand the history of our Christian theology in a more unitive movement, rather than one that splits the church in any unnecessary fashion. Until next time, friends, be safe, and may God bless you.